Hi, here's another little talk on a George Herbert poem, this time Man. And we start slightly differently to normal because we're looking at an image painted, or created rather, drawn by Leonardo da Vinci, based on a principle called the Vitruvian Man. Now, the Vitruvian Man is an idea whereby the perfection of man is emphasized. You can see here the symmetry of the human form, the way it fits both within a square and a circle as images of two perfect shapes. And the Vitruvian idea of man was very important in what we call humanism. Now, humanism developed in Italy in the sort of 13th and 14th centuries, and humanism, in a lot of ways, was very closely associated with Renaissance thought in general. It was a return to classical study and learning, and there's a motto which some of the humanists adopted, which was a line from a Roman play, which goes, "I am a human being. I think nothing human alien to me." And humanism was an exploration of all of human thought. It was an attempt to break out of what the humanists saw as the restrictive practices of medieval scholasticism, of the old habits of monasteries and the old universities, and to try and burst out into a new realm of knowledge. And with this in mind, we're going to have a look at Herbert's perhaps most explicitly humanist poem called Man. And we'll start by reading the first four stanzas. It is a long poem, and I don't intend to go through it all in one go, so I'll just go through it and pick out some of the rather more troubling and difficult details from it. Man. My God, I heard this day that none doth build a stately habitation, but he that means to dwell therein. What house more stately hath there been, or can be, than is man, to whose creation all things are in decay? For man is everything and more. He is a tree, yet bears no fruit, a beast, yet is, or should be more. Reason and speech we only bring. Parrots may thank us, if they are not mute. They go upon the score. Man is all symmetry, full of proportions, one limb to another, and all to all the world besides. Each part may call the farthest brother, and head with foot hath private amity, and both with moons and tides. Nothing hath got so far but man hath caught and kept it as his prey. His eyes dismount the highest star. He is in little all the sphere. Herbs gladly cure our flesh, because that they find their acquaintance there. We'll pause there, because I think that's an appropriate moment just to gather our thoughts on what is going on in this really quite difficult poem. So it begins with a characteristically Herbertian image of a house. As we know, Herbert very often uses images of houses in his poetry, and this is no different. The opening three lines are an exclamation or a reflection on the idea that God has created the stately habitation, this fine abode of human flesh, and it's a wondering, and Herbert, or the speaker in the poem, wonders whether God has built this house and has no intention to dwell within it. In other words, is God going to take up residence in the human spirit, in the human body? And the poem sets up a praise of man, and the question that we have to ask ourselves in this poem is how seriously is it meant and how ironically. And I think these first two stanzas are perhaps very elegantly balanced ironically. There we are, ironically. That great word that we love with a bit of Herbert, even if I can't write the letter Y today. So, rubbing that out, let's move on and unpick a bit more of it. How are these stanzas balanced ironically? Well, the first stanza, man is claimed to be a house more stately than anything else. There can be nothing more stately, and this is the old Herbert spelling of than. There can be nothing more stately, nothing more imposing and impressive than man. And these, to whose creation all things are in decay, means compared to whose creation everything else, all other things, are in a state of decay. So in other words, man's creation is the most perfect part of nature. And this seems to be developed from in the beginning of the next stanza. For man is everything and more. And if you think about that image of a Vitruvian man, with which we began, that perfection of mankind. The next two or three lines, though, I think they're very carefully balanced by Herbert. On the one hand, we have here's a tree, yet bears no fruit. He a beast, yet is, or should be more. Reason and speech we only bring. Herbert contrasts us with trees, with beasts, and states that what we possess is reason and speech. The idea of speech being the distinguishing feature of humans is an ancient one. Shakespeare touches on it in the figure of Caliban, Cliaban in The Tempest, the savage creature whom Prospero, the magician, teaches language. But it's a difficult balance here, because he is a tree yet bears no fruit implies that in some ways man is of little great he's not fruitful. If we think about that beautiful poem Paradise, that's full of images of trees bearing fruit, and yet Herbert here suggests that man is precisely the opposite. He is a tree which bears no fruit, does not contribute anything good to the world. A beast yet is and or should be more. Now a beast, of course, we can see as something savage, perhaps also something driven by sexual desire and lust and nothing more. Man should be more. And I think that balance of yet is or should be is quite elegantly done by Herbert. There's a profound questioning here of saying, well, yes, man should be these things, but the question is why not? And it's not until the very last stanza of the poem that this question is resolved. I love lines 11 and 12 of the poem. Parrots may thank us if they are not mute. In other words, parrots should thank us for teaching them language. They go up on the score. They are in our debt. Now, the next few stanzas develop this image of the Vitruvian man. Here's that word again, Vitruvian, the Vitruvian man. Man is all symmetry, full of proportions, perfectly proportioned, one limb to another. Think of that image of the man fitting within the circle and the square, and all to all the world besides. Now this develops the image in that the human body, is itself a world. I think it's interesting to compare this to Hamlet's soliloquy, what a piece of work is man, which is Hamlet, Act 2, Scene 2. Now, in that speech, Hamlet famously reflects on what it is to be man. He says how noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and in moving. And I think this Herbert seems to be developing the same idea here. The lines 16, 17, 18 develop this image of the human body as, or the metaphor of the human body as a world. Each part of the body may call the farthest brother. In other words, we're all connected, or every part of our body is connected mutually. And when head with foot had private amity, we understand that a gloss on that is the idea that the head and the foot are privately connected in friendly relations. So. And then both are affected by moons and tides. It was a common belief in Herbert's period that the moon affected your state of being, your health, your mental health, your emotions. So the idea is that the body is all equally affected by the moon. Herbert's praise of man goes on. Nothing hath got so far, but man hath caught and kept it. In an age of great exploration, of people of Galileo, for example, with his telescope, and there were great advances in all sorts of optics and discoveries around the world. This, I think, in the fourth stanza is where Herbert is developing his ideas here. Man hath caught and kept everything as his prey. Interesting, though, look at that word, is his prey. This image of man being tremendous, yet there is something still slightly bestial about him. His eyes dismount the highest star. Dismount can mean to challenge the highest star. They're brighter. I wonder if Herbert here isn't reflecting on the question of man, or the advances in optics being made by Galileo. Peering off into the heavens with his telescope. There's a question here. Is this a case of hubris? Now, hubris, as we know, is that failing that characterizes tragic heroes, where they believe they are all-powerful, perhaps, or they are their great overconfidence, which brings about their downfall. The final three lines of this stanza take us to a classical image of the microcosm. The development of the idea that man is a world in himself. He is in little all of the sphere. In other words, the world. He is a miniature version of the world. And Herbert quotes, I think here, probably rather than argues. He cites the idea that the reason why herbs cure our sicknesses is because they find a sympathetic, or they recognise themselves in us. The next two stanzas go on. For us the winds do blow, the earth doth rest, heaven move and fountains flow. Nothing we see but means our good. As our delight or as our treasure, the whole is either our cupboard of food or cabinet of pleasure. The stars have us to bed. Night draws the curtain which the sun withdraws. Music and light attend our head. All things unto our flesh are kind in their descent and being, and to our mind in their ascent and cause. Herbert is beginning to really stretch the extent of the metaphors, and in this poem now, this is a real demonstration of technical skill, and I think it's perhaps, possibly, is he mocking? I'm not sure, but he is certainly evoking the sort of extremes of rhetorical skill. There's that word again, rhetorical skill, which would have been expected of a student at Cambridge at the time. And as we know, Herbert was the orator of the university. He was the university's public speaker, so he was expected to have mastered the art of rhetoric. So in these couple of stanzas, Herbert develops the sort of profound anthrocentric, so it means human-centric, anthrocentric view of the universe. He argues the winds do blow, the earth doth rest, heaven move, fountains flow. There's a sort of breathless quality to the clauses in lines 25 and 26. You might argue that it's a use of a syndeton. The clauses being piled up without any conjunctions. The earth doth rest, heaven move, fountains flow. Rather nice use of alliteration, perhaps at the end of the line, just to evoke that rising ecstasy in the speaker's voice. Nothing we see but means our good, as our delight, as our treasure. These two lines are suggesting that everything we see means our good. In other words, is actively beneficial to us. The whole is, everything is either our cupboard of food or cabinet of pleasure. It either sustains us or gives us delight. The next stanza, the stars have us to bed, is a really rather lovely image. In other words, the stars lead us to bed. So the stars show us the way to our bed. Night draws the curtain, and the sun which the sun withdraws. So the image of night draws the curtain. If you imagine a sort of four-poster bed, night draws the curtains around the bed, and the sun withdraws those curtains. It's nice to think about this as a little contrast to the poem by John Donne called The Sun. Oh heavens, what's happened to my pen? My pen appears to have gone... well, we shall have to stick with this pen, shall we now? The Sun Rising, which is a lovely poem, so what we call an anti-Obard. I definitely recommend you read that. Anyhow, this image of man, music and light, are servants. They attend on us. The last 3 lines of this poem are very, very clever rhetorically. All things unto our flesh are kind, in other words, are related to us, also in the sense of generous. All things are related to us in their descent and being, in other words, in their origins and their essence. Why are they related to us in their origins? Because God created them all, and in their being, they all have God within them. And all things are kind to our mind, in other words, are related to our mind in their ascent and cause, in their lineage and purpose. So they derive their justification from our reason. I think it's worth thinking about these lines in terms of impressive rhetorical display. This isn't necessarily Herbert, I think, making a serious philosophical point, although I think he is perhaps evoking, perhaps gently mocking the, as I've said before, the extremes of rhetorical display, which would have been seen in Cambridge when he was a student there. And so terms such as descent, being, ascent, cause are complex philosophical terms which Herbert is sort of bandying around with a certain degree of witty skill. The final part of the poem is one in which Herbert begins to unpick perhaps the rhetorical ecstasy of the central few stanzas. The final 3 read thus: Each thing is full of duty. Waters united are our navigation, distinguished our habitation. Below our drink, above our meat. Both are our cleanliness. Hath one such beauty? Then how are all things such neat? More servants wait on man than he'll take notice of. In every path he treads down that which doth befriend him, when sickness makes him pale and wan. O mighty love! Man is one world, and hath another to attend him. Since then, my God, thou hast so brave a palace built, O dwell in it, that it may dwell with thee at last. Till then, afford us so much wit, that, as the world serves us, we may serve thee, and both thy servants be. So the impressive rhetoric continues. The speech hasn't yet really finished. The image of nature, the natural world being a servant to us, is developed at the beginning of the 7th stanza. Everything is full of duty. In other words, it's there to serve us. Waters united are our navigation. Is a lovely image of the seas, on which people have been sailing on these journeys of discovery. The image of them being distinguished, in other words, separated, are our habitation. This is a reference to the book of Genesis, to the creation myth. The first thing God did, not the first thing, sorry, after dividing the light from the dark and the sea from the dry land, he divided the waters from the dry land, and in doing so created dry land, and therefore the habitation, a place for humans to live, to inhabit. The image of waters below our drink, so line 40 develops the image of waters by arguing that waters below, i.e. the water from rivers, is for us to drink, and the water from above, i.e. rain, waters the land and allows food to grow our meat. Both are our cleanliness. In other words, we wash in both of them. The stanza concludes with a lovely rhetorical figure of what we might call an exemplum. By taking the example of waters, Herbert as the sort of classical, the great orator, takes the image of waters as an example of to prove his point that creation and man is a wonderful thing. If one thing is so beautiful, in other words, the water, then all things. How are all things neat? In other words, the only conclusion which can be drawn is that God is the reason all things are neat, well proportioned, and exquisite. It's a lovely example of rhetorical questions. The 8th stanza, however, marks a little bit of a change, I think, and Herbert in the 8th stanza sets up the ironic conclusion to the poem. We've reached this wonderful moment of these two rhetorical questions, where the audience is fully agreeing with the speaker, saying, yes, we completely agree with your argument. But in the 8th stanza, man's limitations are revealed. He doesn't take notice of everything. He treads down that. In other words, what's being referred to here is healing herbs and plants. So the image of someone who goes out for a walk and in walking tramples down the very herbs and plants which will befriend him, which will heal him and make him better when he is pale and wan, when he's sick. So I think Herbert is beginning to suggest in here that yes, man is a tremendous piece of creation, but in his actions, quite the opposite, perhaps blind, ignorant, and rather limited. In the following line, O mighty love, recalls one of the lines from the Psalms, Psalm 8, where the psalmist meditations on what is man. And yet, I can't help think that Herbert is drawing a distinction between the mighty love of God's creation and perhaps the ironic mighty love which man possesses to destroy those things which should be helping him. That very characteristic technique in Herbert's poetry to reveal to us that what we as humans think we are most excellent in is actually very often we are most blind about. And then the poem finishes on a splendidly different note. Since then, my God, thou hast so brave a palace built. O dwell in it, that it may dwell with thee at last. I can't help but think here that Herbert is ending this poem with a lovely note of saying, well, yes, humans are fabulous creatures. They're the most excellent things in all the world, but without God, we aren't really very much. And the final 3 lines, till then, afford us, in other words, give us so much wit, that as the world serves us, we may serve, and there's a missing E here, thee, and both thy servants be. So from all this praise, or this exaltation that man is served by everything in nature, all this image of duty, attending that we've had so far in the poem, ends with the reflection that actually man must himself become a servant of God. Hubris, I think Herbert is suggesting, is something which we could well do without. And so to conclude, a couple of thoughts about the poem in critical terms. Bloch described it as a hymn in C major. Formal, ceremonious praise without modulations of to the minor. Formal and ceremonious, he says. Do we agree? Have I been over-emphasising the ironic qualities of the poem, which I think I've identified? There's certainly a lot to agree with in Bloch. Dessner, on the other hand, argues that it is someone, the speaker is exposed as someone who has lost sight of his duty to God. Lost sight of his duty to God. Interesting pair of contrasting images. Strier, Strier, argues that the conclusion ironically reverses the humanism of the rest of the poem. Let's put a conclusion in here. There we are. It's a really interesting poem, this one. Is Herbert mocking the rhetorical excesses of his youth? Is he perhaps praising man, but also asking man to consider a wider view of his creation? Or is he perhaps doing something entirely different, which I leave up to you to decide and publish in your PhD thesis, and please at least quote me in your references. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed this little video. Thanks for watching.